amidst all these things, there was this China Belt and Road Summit. And that is when Putin visited. A lot of other countries visited. India did not go for the third time, 2017, 19, and this time. Help us understand what is happening there. Which side, where is this whole thing going about the Belt Road? And India obviously has its own issues, sovereignty issues, in terms of, whether it's a good viable thing for the Chinese to go for that, because a lot of this is coming through Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So all those things help us understand how this thing is panning out, whether how should we understand it, this whole thing going on, whether India, how should India engage with the Middle East corridor. That sort also is a big question mark for us.
Well, in terms of China, despite its significant and growing economic problems, it's still pushing forward with all these projects because it's going to try to project power no matter what happens internally. We have seen the same thing with the Soviet Union, with Iran, with Russia. All these countries have horrible internal economic situations, but they are continuing onwards with projecting global power and spending money elsewhere that creates even more internal instability. Eventually, with some push, such regimes can collapse, or they can be overtaken by internal coup and end up in some other direction. But right now, we're not nearly at that point yet, and certainly not with China, which is actually still the most powerful of all these actors. And as bad as the situation is internally, it still has plenty towards uh, towards such projects, and it's still continuing with that path, and it's still trying to project influence. And a lot of countries are still very dependent on it. So let's not forget that it does have its leverage for now. It hasn't. It's not like it has lost all of its spheres of influence, all of its allies and proxies and so forth. In fact, in some areas, it's actually growing and succeeding quite a lot, and its industrial espionage machinery is also quite functional. So I think that is not going to be resolved anytime soon. I do think that India is in an increasingly beneficial position vis-a-vis China, simply because China is mismanaging so much of its own internal affairs, and because some countries are becoming concerned of being dependent on China if it cannot carry through its promises of investments. I think that's where India and some of its allies can have a positive long term impact. I'm not talking about military operations, but simply economic investments being seen as a more stable place for doing business, investing in other countries, and having just other options besides China. I think that alone could be very positive. With regards to the Middle East corridor, I don't really see any movement. The corridor itself was not clearly defined to begin with, which was a major mistake, similar to what happened with Abraham Accords. Abraham Accords was at least temporarily beneficial as a trade value, but as soon as things went awry, we saw Middle Eastern countries roll back their products from Israel. We've seen a lot of things collapse very quickly. So I think unless there's a very clear definition of mutual obligations towards this Middle Eastern corridor, I don't think it's going to go very far, and certainly not if some of the parties end up being subsumed with other problems. And right now, we are facing this very immediate test to the situation, the exact sort of thing I was worried about before all of that happened. If you recall, that this exact thing happened just now. This operation is really going to challenge this commitment, because this corridor was supposed to be partially tied to Israel. There's no telling where it's all going to go now that Israel is occupied with the war. Other Middle Eastern states are withdrawing from Israel. Saudi Arabia is, I don't know, dealing with Qatar and Iran, which is not something that India necessarily is positive for it. I think Iran's been causing some level of problems even in India, and Qatar has been funding all sorts of Islamist movements. So I think all of these things, these political issues, need to be discussed and resolved before moving forward with significant financial commitments towards projects, because otherwise it's going to be a huge waste of money that's, at best going to be either a cheap PR effort, or if there is a significant financial commitment, it can go to waste and be easily disrupted by all these political factors. So I think this is a good time to kind of try to figure out what is going on, sit down and have adult conversations with substance, and not just something that's done to show that, there's diplomatic breakthroughs in election years for various countries.